It was 7 a.m. on June 12, 1962. A guard walked the quiet, iron-lined floor of Alcatraz's cell block B. It was a routine morning count, the kind of mundane, mechanical task that defines a life sentence in the most secure federal penitentiary in American history. He stopped at cell 138, expecting to see a man named Frank Morris awake, standing by the bars and ready for the day. The figure in the bed was motionless. The guard shouted. There was no movement. He shouted again, sharper, louder, his voice echoing off the cold concrete. Silence. When the guard finally reached through the bars and pushed the figure, the head didn't just move. It rolled off the pillow and hit the floor with a hollow, synthetic clack. It wasn't a man, it was a masterpiece of deception. A dummy constructed from a proprietary mix of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper, adorned with real human hair stolen from the prison barbershop. By the time the guard realized the deception, the impossible had already occurred. 3 of the most dangerous, high-risk inmates in the federal prison system, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, had vanished into the freezing fog of the San Francisco Bay. Before we dive into the exact mechanical and psychological breakdown of how this happened, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you believe these 3 men actually outsmarted the most heavily fortified island in America and lived to tell the tale? Or do you think the federal government was right and the brutal currents of the bay swallowed them whole? Let me know your verdict below, because the empirical evidence we are about to uncover might entirely change your mind. If you find yourself drawn to the dark mechanics of how history's most guarded secrets are dismantled, you're in the right place. We analyze the machinery of the past here, stripping away the myths to look at the raw data. Make sure to subscribe, because we are just getting started. To understand how this escape fractured the illusion of the American penal system, you must first understand the psychological warfare of Alcatraz itself. The rock was never designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to break the human spirit. It was the end of the line, a dumping ground for the men that other federal prisons simply could not contain. It sat on a jagged island surrounded by water that hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, swept by vicious 8-knot currents capable of dragging a grown man out into the Pacific Ocean in a matter of minutes. The architecture was specifically engineered to induce hopelessness, but the system made a critical, fatal miscalculation. By putting the most brilliant, obsessive escape artists in the country under one roof, they didn't just isolate them. They inadvertently built a masterclass in criminal engineering. These weren't petty thieves. Frank Lee Morris was the architect of the operation. He possessed an IQ of 133, ranking him in the top 2% of the population. Orphaned at age 11, he had spent his entire life being processed by the system, drifting through foster homes before graduating to state penitentiaries. Morris was not just intelligent, he possessed institutional patience. He had already successfully orchestrated a breakout from the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He understood the architecture of confinement better than the wardens who built it. He knew how to manipulate the rigid hierarchy of the cell block, how to exploit microscopic structural weaknesses, and most importantly, how to keep a team of volatile men focused on a singular, impossible goal for nearly a year. Beside him were the brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. Raised in a family of 14 children as migrant farm workers in Georgia, they were hardened, highly resourceful, and fiercely loyal to one another. They were bank robbers who had attempted multiple escapes from the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, which ultimately earned them their one-way tickets to Alcatraz. The Anglin brothers had spent their lives working with their hands, and that blue-collar background was the critical engine of this escape. They were the ones who would spend hundreds of hours doing the agonizing physical labor, chipping away at concrete and vulcanizing rubber. They weren't just taking orders from Morris. They were the muscle, the endurance, and the practical craftsmen that turned Morris's theoretical blueprints into a physical reality. And then there was Alan West, the 4th member of the cohort, and the most tragic. West was the logistical mind who helped map the utility shafts and the prison's internal topography. He worked on the maintenance detail, which gave him unparalleled access to materials and a mental blueprint of the prison's blind spots. But, as history would have it, West would become the ultimate cautionary tale. He was the man who, when the moment of execution finally arrived, couldn't clear the last physical hurdle. He was left behind in his cell, listening to his accomplices crawl toward freedom. Because he failed, West became the primary informant for the FBI. Everything we know about the mechanics of this escape, we know because Alan West sat in an interrogation room and broke down the entire operation, piece by piece. This wasn't a sudden chaotic break. It was an 8-month clandestine industrial project, happening right under the noses of the armed guards. Alcatraz was supposedly impenetrable, but the environment was working against the architecture. The saltwater air of the bay had slowly eroded the concrete over decades. The escapees recognized that the walls around their air vents were structurally compromised. They needed to reach the utility corridor, a 3-foot-wide maze of pipes and plumbing directly behind their cell walls. But they didn't have tools, so they invented them. They stole heavy industrial spoons from the mess hall and meticulously sharpened the handles into chisels. They purloined a broken vacuum cleaner motor and managed to rig it into a mechanized precision drill. To mask the grinding, screeching noise of metal destroying concrete, they timed their daily excavation to the prison's mandated music hour, an auditory camouflage where the sounds of amateur accordions and guitars drowned out the sound of a prison being dismantled from the inside. Every night they were ghosts in the system. During the day they hid their excavation behind flawless hand-painted replicas of the cell grates. They manufactured these fake grates from cardboard, binding them with stolen art supplies. It was a visual deception so precise it fooled guards walking mere inches away at 3 in the morning. But getting out of the cell was only the first variable in a massive, deadly equation. The real problem was the water. To survive the bay, they had to manufacture a boat. Over the course of months, they systematically stole more than 50 regulation rubber-backed raincoats from the prison's clothing factory. They didn't just stitch these together, they actively vulcanized the seams. By scraping the hot steam pipes in the utility corridor against the rubber, they chemically fused the raincoats into a waterproof, airtight seal. They built a 6 by 14-foot pontoon raft, complete with individual life vests, and ingeniously modified a stolen musical accordion to serve as a mechanical bellows to inflate the craft once they reached the shoreline. On the night of June 11th, the operation was finally triggered. The incredibly lifelike dummy heads were placed on the pillows. Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped out of their cells, removing the fake grates and crawling into the pitch-black utility corridor. This is where Alan West's meticulously planned timeline collapsed. The concrete around his vent had hardened, locking his grate in place. In the dark, the desperation set in. Morris and the Anglins could not afford to wait. The window of opportunity was rapidly closing. They made the brutal, calculated decision to leave West behind. The 3 remaining men climbed 30 feet of sheer plumbing pipes to reach the ceiling of the cell block. They pried open a ventilation shaft, severing the heavy iron rivets, and pushed their way onto the roof of the prison. The wind was howling. At approximately 10:30 p.m., guards actually heard a loud crash as the men broke through, but writing it off as nothing more than shifting equipment in the high winds, they did not investigate. Morris and the brothers crawled across more than 100 feet of open rooftop, exposed to the elements and the sweeping gaze of the guard towers. They located a 50-foot bakery smokestack and slid down to the ground, landing in a blind spot near the prison's shower area. They scaled a massive 12-foot barbed wire fence and finally reached the jagged rocks of the shoreline. When they used their modified accordion to inflate that raft and launched it into the churning, freezing black waters of the San Francisco Bay, they were entering a thermodynamic death trap. They were betting their lives and 8 months of flawless preparation on the hope that their homemade seams would hold against the crushing force of the Pacific tide. By the time the sun rose and the alarm sounded on June 12th, the bay had swallowed their trail. The FBI, the Coast Guard, and the military launched one of the most intensive, exhaustive manhunts in American history. Over the next few weeks, they found agonizingly sparse fragments of evidence. A makeshift wooden paddle was discovered floating near Angel Island. A deflated piece of the raincoat raft washed ashore. And, most hauntingly, a plastic bag tightly wrapped in inner tube rubber was pulled from the water. Inside were the Anglin brothers' personal family photographs, deliberately sealed to survive the journey. But no bodies were ever recovered. Not a single piece of human remains. The FBI officially closed the case in 1979, cementing the narrative that the men had succumbed to hypothermia and drowned. The agency argued that the water was too cold, the tide too strong, and the raft too flimsy. It was the perfectly wrapped conclusion that the government desperately needed to maintain the myth of the inescapable prison. But the United States Marshal Service refused to accept this conclusion, and to this day, their case file remains active. The contrarian view, and the one backed by decades of anomalous evidence, is that the system simply could not admit defeat. In the 2010s, a photograph surfaced, allegedly taken in Brazil in 1975, showing two men bearing a striking, biometric resemblance to John and Clarence Anglin. Independent facial recognition experts analyzed the bone structure, the orbital spacing, and the hairlines, concluding that it was highly probable the men in the photo were the escaped brothers. Then came the bombshell of 2013. The San Francisco Police Department received a handwritten letter. It read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I am 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer." Yes, we all made it that night, but barely. The letter claimed that Morris died in 2005 and Clarence in 2011. The FBI tested the letter for fingerprints and DNA, but the results were officially deemed inconclusive. Inconclusive is not a denial. It is a lingering, uncomfortable shadow over the official narrative. We are left analyzing two conflicting realities. The empirical constraints of human biology and oceanography point to a tragic, freezing death in the dark waters, an inevitable, violent end for men attempting to break an unbreakable system. But the total lack of physical bodies, the sheer, undeniable genius of Frank Morris's planning, and the steady trickle of circumstantial evidence over the last 60 years keep the paradox alive. The system wants you to believe they failed, because if they succeeded, it means the ultimate authority is nothing more than an illusion that can be dismantled with stolen spoons and unmatched willpower. Did three men truly beat the rock? Or did the San Francisco Bay simply finish the execution that the federal government couldn't legally carry out? The evidence is laid out before you, but the final verdict is yours. Let me know your exact theory in the comments section right now,